Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and I figured that today we'd pick back up with our series on Peter Sloterdijk's Spheres Trilogy. We're in Bubbles, and now we've come to the chapter on Negative Gynecology. Negative Gynecology, of course, is one of his many neologisms. The book is replete with examples of his neologistic genius, it's an important chapter. This chapter sort of frames the rest of particularly this book, but in some sense the series as a whole, if you think about it in terms of transference phenomena and that sort of thing. And so in this chapter, we're being drawn to the womb and the vulva as the portal into the womb. Okay? And you might ask, why are we talking about these things? What is the philosophical significance of the vulva? Well, there's a lot of philosophical significance to the vulva. I think this sort of thing is supposed to be fun, by the way, and it's supposed to kind of resist academic, technical language and discussions which are dry and verbose and boring. It's supposed to resist that. Sloterdijk in general wants to resist that sort of thing. So the fact that the language seems like a problem for dry academic discourse is good for Sloterdijk. That's what he's going for. But so the question, why are we being drawn to this area? Why are these things being thematized? Well, we've been moving back, right? We've talked about romantic love. We've talked about interfaciality. We've talked about the magic circle, right? In which we start to see sort of the walls between subjects and objects breaking down. I mean, we sort of do in all these things, but the magic circle being a circle that forms between different subjects in which their subjectivity is sort of melted into a kind of collective subjectivity, right? We're moving back from all this stuff, and we're moving to the origin point of human life, which is in the womb, right? And what's important, obviously, remember that this whole project, we're talking about sort of moving away from this idea of Cartesian subject-object metaphysics, of bourgeois individualism, etc., and we're trying to move into an understanding of human beings as always involved in these kind of resonant bipolar intimacies, right? And so we've been moving back, and we come to the origin point of human life, in which what we see is a bipolar intimacy, mother and fetus, in which for one of those, at least for the fetus, its experience is pre-subjective. We are talking about a world which is prior to the division of subjects and objects, right? Prior to the division of things into subjects and objects. Even when the baby is born, I've talked about this in some sort of previous videos, we have, this kind of primary narcissistic idea in which everything is me, right? And becoming a subject, becoming subjectivated, developing subjectivity, and developing, psychologically developing, etc. What that entails, in this Lacanian sense, is alienation and separation, right? In which you're pushed into the region of language and civilization, right? That's necessary in order to navigate a world of subjects and objects in some sense. But so he's pushing us back to this point, and he's meditating on, again, this kind of Neolithic revolution in which people become more sedentary, they become agrarian. And he talks about the way that then the mother in the womb takes on all this extra significance metaphysically for people, after this Neolithic revolution, because of these developments. Because all of a sudden you start burying the dead, you're tied to a particular location, your livelihood depends upon raising crops and things like that. And what does that involve? Like the womb, you plant a seed into the earth, And somehow in this kind of reproductive magic, right, the earth pushes it out again into the world as a living being, as a plant, right? It's turned this kernel into something, right, through this kind of magical activity. And of course, we come from wombs, we come from woman, we pass through the vulva, right, from a region that is unavailable to our senses, right? We can't see the womb. We see this portal between the non-world, between pre-life, right, between death, between the other world and our world. That's what we see. That's what this vulva represents, right? This kind of passageway between non-being and being, between appearance and a kind of world beyond appearances. And that's the kind of thing that we see. And so he thinks that this Neolithic revolution means that there's this kind of extra fascinogenicity that the womb acquires and that the vulva acquires. And that's when you get this kind of womb to tomb idea, this idea that, truth is tied to the origin and tied to our telos. You could ask these questions like, where did life come from? Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? All of these questions seem to point to, a confrontation with the vulva, right? And so the vulva becomes, in Sloterdijk's conception here, this kind of barrier, I guess, between the world of subjects and objects and a world beyond that, right? As he says, these mystics in all kinds of times and places tend to express this kind of fundamental monism idea, that everything is ultimately one, everything is connected. They point beyond subject-object metaphysics, right, to a metaphysical monism, in which the appearance of difference, the appearance of change, all of those things are, in some sense, illusory, right? And so he's thinking about these things, and he's thinking about mysticism and mysticism's connection to monism, and this as being a kind of, if we philosophically reject subject-object metaphysics, right? We reject Cartesianism, then what are we talking about? Right? He thinks that philosophy and mysticism, philosophy and a world beyond subject-object experience, the experience of subject and object, discourse that involves subjects and objects, that these two things are sort of incompatible, philosophy and mysticism in this sense. Because once you pass through this portal, you move into a region that is, you move into a region that reason has no access into, that the logos cannot penetrate. And so these two things kind of resist each other, right? And yet, this mystical region, this kind of monism beyond dualism, seems to be an attempt to move beyond subjects and objects, right, into a deeper truth, right? The truth of the origin of all life, if you want to kind of move back along this sort of metaphorical route. But these two worlds can't meet, and they can't communicate with one another. Once you have this kind of mystical experience or whatever, subject-object metaphysics is dissolved. There's no longer subjects. There's no longer objects. Then it's, you're an alien. It's an experience that can't be talked about. It can't be communicated. It's incommunicable. And so that's what negative gynecology is an attempt to sort of do. It's an attempt to focusing in particular on this region that in some sense we have kind of access to, this region of pre-life, right, before we become a subject. And he wants to point out that that we shouldn't think about this monistically. We should think that even when we pass beyond the vulva into this other world and have this mystical experience of oneness or whatever, you're still, as the fetus, involved in this kind of bipolar intimacy. The fetus in the womb is beyond subjects and objects. It's having experiences that are beyond that. It has no differentiation between itself and the placenta and the mother and the womb and all this kind of stuff. But nevertheless, it's engaged in these resonances with others, right? And he talks about this concept of no objects, something like that he gets from Thomas Macho. And so this becomes important. For example, he'll talk about something later called like placental nihilism. And this idea is sort of like although the placenta doesn't exist for the object of the fetus, or doesn't exist as an object for the subject of the fetus, right? Because there are no subjects and objects yet for the fetus. It's experienced as a kind of as an accompanying thing, right? There's this accompanying part of my experience that later it's separated from, right? And so even though this wasn't really an object for a subject, nevertheless, there's this kind of trace of it, right, that continues to exist for us psychologically later in life. So I think this is kind of what the concept of an object is about. It's not a subject, it's not an object, and yet it has reality, right? It has existence. And you can think about this in terms of things that are beyond speech. They haven't yet been named. They haven't yet been symbolized, right? That's what you could think about, like, X-rays or something like that. I think that idea comes from, maybe it comes from here, but it might come from the Critique of Cynical Reason. But he has this idea that our ontological world, the world of beings, right, gets expanded all the time by science, right? All of a sudden, it's disclosed to us that there's light that is invisible to us. There's ultraviolet light and things like that. So this whole region of being becomes disclosed to us that was there always, that was there with us, that might have had an impact on us, that might have been doing something to us, right? That might have meant something at some level to us, and yet it hadn't been named, so it couldn't be an object for us yet. This is kind of the status of everything, sort of, for the fetus, right? And so he wants to think about this world of the fetus, this experience of being in the womb, of being with all of this stuff that is not yet an object. And he wants to not allow us to, moving beyond subjects and objects, become totally divorced from the world, become totally divorced from reason and logic and the sayable, become unable to have discourse. He wants to think about this region of sort of this deeper truth, right? That nevertheless we can talk about, that we can draw insights from. He wants to develop a conceptual vocabulary that extends beyond subject-object metaphysics, right? Which, has typically been thought by mystics throughout time and stuff like that as an illusion in some way. But experiences that people have in mysticism, mystical experiences or whatever, where they go beyond this, are seen as, nonsense. They can't be talked about or anything like that. And so negative gynecology, the idea is basically, he has this idea of positive gynecology, in which he calls it Aristotelian, in which you're like standing in front of the vulva as an object, like a gynecologist, right? And the sort of symbolics of homecoming, a portal to the other world, the passageway between life and non-life, being and non-being, etc., all this stuff, all the signification of the vulva doesn't matter for the positive gynecologist. He sees an object with a set of properties that can be manipulated in a set of ways or whatever, right? And so he thinks that, we can understand someone standing in front of a cave, who has walked up to the entrance of a cave and is examining it as an object, right? And the real truth seeker, historically, the mystic, goes into the cave, right? And so you can experience the cave or think about the cave, talk about the cave in sort of two distinct ways. One in which you're standing outside of it, it's an object, and you're describing it or something like that as an object. And the other in which you go into it, in which the distinction between, it kind of loses the metaphor here, but the distinction between subject and object falls away. You're desubjectivated. There's this oneness, right? And then you're outside of the realm of the logos, right? You lose contact. You can't talk to people outside of the cave. There's an interesting, connection here that you could be making with like Plato in the cave. The philosopher is somebody who comes out of the cave and things like that. This is a movement he talks about later, in which we moved from this kind of agro-metaphysical moment of vulva and womb fascination or something out into the transcendent, in which we start talking about like heaven, the heavens and things like that. And that's kind of the masculine supplement to this, but we don't need to get into that now. But so his idea of negative gynecology is that, and he calls it a fiction. He says we can weave this fiction. Let me try to find it here. Yeah, he says in the following, so as he proceeds in the book, we weave the fiction that we can split up our adventurous intelligence in such a way that one half takes up position at the entry ramp to the mystical cave, still viewing it from the outside, that is, while the other half is initiated into the homogeneous totality of darkness. The two halves should remain in contact during the excursion. The one inside by reporting its states in the objectless sphere to the outside, and the other one waiting antiportus by sending suggestions for the verbalization of the indescribable into the cave. So the aim is not to produce a mystical experience, but rather to advance a theory of dyadic intimacy to the point where speaking theory normally turns into silent theory. He wants to bridge this gap, to be able to talk about experiences that about which normally one must remain silent, right? If we are to talk about a world beyond subjects and objects, beyond language, beyond what Lacan would call symbolic castration, then we need to be able to talk about what hasn't been symbolized in some way, right? We need to be able to talk about what is outside the domain of the ontologically known universe. And so he thinks that the reality of the relationship between the mother and the unborn includes the non-existence of that relationship for the child. As long as it's living in the mother, it in fact floats in a sort of non-duality. The same is for the mystic, in proximity to the actually present object. The subject too is disarmed and dissolves. And so he says, we'll follow Thomas Macho's observation on the logic of basic psychoanalytic principles and examine this logical oddity. Did I mention the no objects already? I think so. That one class of closeness relationship with the other is only real if these are denied or erased as relationships. Okay. There's another thing I wanted to say that I don't know if I say. Yeah, he says this is the critical phase of our phenomenological expedition, right, into the formal sequence of bipolar closeness and intimacy spheres. This is what I said at the beginning. We've been moving back, right? We're moving all the way back into the most primordial kinds of bipolar closeness and intimacy spheres, in which we have a kind of total dissolution of subjects as subjects, right? Objects as objects. And so he's saying this is a critical phase because we're pushing up against a world that in some sense cannot be described, right? And so he says from here on, intimacy means proximity to the barrier which seals off the inside of the mother from the public world. We're in the public world, we're trying to have discourse in the public world about something that is sealed off from us, that is beyond our capacity to access it in a way that doesn't dissolve us as subjects. That doesn't, it's like a vortex that sucks us in and destroys us in some sense as, living, speaking, normal human beings that participate in the public world, right? And so we're in this critical phase where we need to develop a kind of way of thinking about and talking about this barrier and what comes after the barrier, right? A way of talking about this confrontation that doesn't result in our obliteration and our inability to speak at all. It's a and he says, if a confrontation between the eye and the womb's entrance transpires, in this critical phase, in the examination of the field of intimacy, then we are faced with this issue of whether the subject and object will separate at positive gynecology, or whether the subject will enter into the object to such an extent that the object character of it is lost. Right? And negative gynecology is an attempt to avoid either one of these two fates. Right? We need to be able to speak about these experiences, speak about the pre-subjective, speak about, the deepest kinds of bipolar intimacies without being dissolved by them, right? And so that's what negative gynecology is. That's what his project is, in some sense, for the rest of the book, is to learn to talk about this, to figure out a way of talking about it, to figure out a kind of, metaphorics of non-objectivity, right? That doesn't devolve into mystical mumbo jumbo, right? And so that's what negative gynecology is. I hope that that makes some sense, even though in some sense, there is a kind of deliberate effort to avoid it making so much sense that it devolves into a kind of cliche, that it devolves into what Heidegger calls chatter, right? This should continue to perplex us and give rise to thought and stuff like that. I like this metaphor of negative gynecology, and we're gonna proceed on this path in later episodes, and you'll see kind of the way that it works out. For now, this is a pretty short chapter, but for now, I'm John for Think Culture. Remember, don't simply react, but think culture.